The whip cut through the thick Georgia air with a crack like thunder splitting wood. With every impact, Naomi's body lurched forward, her wrists tied to the whipping post standing in the middle of the yard at Bellwether Plantation. In rivulets, blood streamed down her back, soaking into the simple cotton dress that hung in tatters off her shoulders. After the first dozen lashes, she had stopped screaming. Now only a whimper escaped her, a sound so broken and small it seemed to rise from deep beneath the earth, rather than any human throat. 10 feet away stood Thomas Bellwether, his face crimson with fury, his expensive white shirt drenched with sweat, in the oppressive August heat of 1858. A large man he was, over 6 feet tall with a barrel chest and hands the size of dinner plates. For nearly 3 decades, at 53 years old, he had owned Bellwether Plantation. Throughout Baldwin County during that time, he had built a reputation as a harsh master who tolerated no defiance, no hesitation, no hint of independence from the 200 enslaved people working his cotton fields. An extension of his authority was the whip in his hand, and he wielded it with the casual brutality of someone who had never once questioned his right to do so. Simple and damning was the offense that had brought Naomi to this post. That morning, one of the child workers, a boy named Moses, who could not have been more than 8 years old, had stumbled while carrying a heavy bucket of water to the field hands. The water had spilled, and with his riding crop raised, Thomas had descended on the child, fully intending to beat the boy for his clumsiness. Working nearby, Naomi had done something that sealed her fate. Between Thomas and the child, she had stepped. She had not raised her hand to him, had not spoken a word of defiance, yet the act itself was unforgivable. A white master had been physically blocked by an enslaved woman from administering punishment. The hierarchy that kept the entire system functioning had been challenged, and Thomas could not let that stand. So now she hung from the post while he administered what he called justice, and what anyone with a functioning conscience would recognize as torture. Enforced witness around the yard, other enslaved workers stood, their faces carefully blank, their eyes fixed on the ground. Long ago they had learned that showing emotion during these spectacles could make you the next victim. Into their mothers' skirts, children pressed their faces. Their jaws clenched, old men who had survived decades of this brutality stared at nothing. And through it all, the whip kept falling. Before we continue with this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're listening from. Let's strengthen our community so no one forgets these stories. Thank you, and let's continue. On the wide front porch of the main house, which overlooked the scene with architectural indifference, stood Thomas's 3 sons. Ely, the eldest at 28, leaned against a column with his arms crossed, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His father's size and temperament he had inherited, and he watched the whipping with the detached interest of someone observing a horse being broken. Richard, the middle son at 25, stood beside him with a glass of whiskey in his hand, despite the early hour. Smaller than his brother, he was wiry and quick-tempered, and with obvious approval he watched the scene, occasionally offering commentary that made Ely chuckle. But the youngest son, Samuel, stood apart from his brothers at the far end of the porch. At 22 years old, he was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that seemed to hold a perpetual sadness. Unlike his brothers who wore expressions of satisfaction, Samuel's face had gone pale. So tightly did his hands grip the porch railing that his knuckles had turned white. And if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen that he was trembling, not with fear, but with something else, something that had been building inside him for years and was now threatening to explode. always different from his brothers, Samuel had been. While Eli and Richard had embraced their father's worldview completely, accepting without question that enslaved people were property to be used and discarded as needed, Samuel had struggled with doubts that he barely dared to acknowledge even to himself. By a tutor from Massachusetts, he had been educated, a man who had inadvertently exposed him to abolitionist literature and ideas about human equality that were dangerous in the South of 1858. When Thomas discovered the nature of these readings, the tutor had been dismissed, but in Samuel's mind, the seeds had been planted, and they had grown in secret like forbidden flowers. He had tried to ignore these thoughts, tried to accept the world as his father and brothers accepted it. But moments like this made it impossible. With each strike of the whip, he watched Naomi's body convulse. The blood stained the dust beneath her feet. He watched and felt something inside him crack like a dam that could no longer hold back the flood. This was wrong. It was evil, and simply by standing here and allowing it to happen, he was complicit. After 40 lashes that seemed to stretch into eternity, when the whipping finally ended, Naomi hung limp from the post, barely conscious. To one of his overseers, a brutal man named Carver, Thomas tossed the whip and wiped his brow with a handkerchief. "Let her hang there until sunset," he ordered. "Then cut her down and throw her in the storage shed. If she survives the night, she can go back to work. If not, we will bury her with the others." Like a physical blow, the casual dismissal of a human life, the complete indifference to whether Naomi lived or died, struck Samuel. Unable to watch any longer, he turned and walked into the house, his brother's laughter following him like accusation. As the sun set in a blaze of orange and red that seemed obscene, given the day's brutality that evening, Carver cut Naomi down from the post. Into the dust she collapsed, unable to stand, barely able to breathe. To drag her to the storage shed, a small wooden structure at the edge of the property that was used to house broken equipment and supplies, 2 other enslaved workers were ordered. On the dirt floor they laid her, and there in the darkness they left her, closing the door behind them. No one expected her to survive the night. Deep and certain to become infected in the filth of the shed were the wounds on her back. No water, no food, no medical attention did she have. To die alone she had been left, and everyone on the plantation understood that this was the intended outcome. But as night fell, and the plantation settled into uneasy sleep, in his comfortable bedroom on the 2nd floor of the main house, Samuel lay awake. As the whip fell, he could not stop seeing Naomi's face. The sounds she had made, he could not stop hearing. Around midnight, when he was certain that his father and brothers were asleep, he rose from his bed and dressed quietly in dark clothing. A pitcher of water, some clean cloths, and a piece of cornbread wrapped in a napkin he took from the kitchen. Bandages and a small bottle of laudanum for pain he took from his mother's medicine cabinet. 3 years earlier, his mother had died, and since her passing, these supplies had remained untouched. Like a ghost he moved through the dark house, terrified that every creaking floorboard would wake his father. Alive with sound was the Georgia night outside. In the darkness, crickets sang. From the nearby creek, frogs called. And somewhere in the distance at the moon, a hound bayed. Across the yard, past the slave cabins, where people slept packed together in spaces barely fit for animals, past the cotton gin and the barns, toward the storage shed at the edge of the property, Samuel made his way. In his chest, his heart hammered. Not just for him, but potentially for Naomi as well. What he was doing was dangerous. For both of them, if his father discovered this, the punishment would be severe. But Samuel could not stop himself. That afternoon something inside him had broken, and he could not simply allow a woman to die alone in the darkness when he had the power to help her. He reached the shed, and outside the door paused, listening for any sound that might indicate she was still alive. Hearing nothing, he carefully pushed the door open. Immediately, the smell hit him, the copper scent of blood mixed with sweat and fear. In the darkness, lying motionless on the floor, he could barely make out her form. "Naomi," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I have brought water and bandages. I want to help you." There was no response. For a terrible moment, Samuel thought he was too late, that she had already died. But then he heard it, a faint rasping breath, and he felt a rush of relief so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. He knelt beside her and carefully lit a small candle he had brought, shielding the flame with his hand so it would not be visible from outside. In the flickering light, the extent of her injuries he could see. A mass of torn flesh was her back, the wounds crisscrossing in a horrific pattern that made his stomach turn. Soaked with blood was her dress, and in shallow, pained gasps, her breathing came. Dried blood caked her arms, where she had been bound to the post, and with pain and blood loss, her face was ashen. Up close, Samuel had never seen suffering like this, and far worse than anything his imagination had prepared him for was the reality of it. As he dampened one of the cloths with water and very gently began to clean the wounds on her back, his hands shook. At his touch, Naomi stirred, a small sound of pain escaping her lips, but she did not open her eyes. As carefully as he could, Samuel worked, cleaning away the dirt and blood, trying not to cause more damage to the torn flesh. In the dim candlelight, it was difficult work, and terrified he was that more harm than good he was doing. But driven by a desperation to do something, anything, to counter the evil he had witnessed, he persisted. When he had cleaned the wounds as best he could, with water he mixed a small amount of laudanum and held it to her lips. "Drink this," he whispered. "It will help with the pain." Unfocused and glazed with fever, Naomi's eyes fluttered open. Without recognition, without trust, she looked at him, but too weak to resist, she was as he helped her drink. To help her sleep, the laudanum would, to dull the worst of the pain, at least temporarily. Carefully then, bandages to her back Samuel applied, though he knew they would need to be changed regularly to prevent infection. Finally, plain water he helped her drink, small sips that she could manage without choking. Desperately she drank, her body crying out for hydration after the trauma it had endured. When she had drunk as much as she could, with a clean blanket he had brought, Samuel covered her, and where she could reach it if she woke and felt strong enough to eat, he placed the cornbread. "I will come back tomorrow night," he told her, though he was not sure if she could hear or understand him. "Please hold on. Please survive." He extinguished the candle and slipped back out into the night, his heart still racing, his hands still shaking. On a path that he did not fully understand, but could no longer avoid, he had taken the first step. In a daze the next day, Samuel moved through his routine. Through breakfast with his father and brothers he sat, listening to them discuss plantation business and laugh about the previous day's whipping. In his father's office he worked, managing accounts and correspondence, the mundane details of running a plantation built on human suffering. And through it all, in that shed his mind was, wondering if Naomi had survived the night, wondering if his small act of mercy had been enough or too late. With fresh water, more bandages, and a small amount of beef broth he had managed to steal from the kitchen, that night he returned to the shed. When he entered the shed, he found Naomi awake, still lying on the floor, still clearly in terrible pain she was, but her eyes were open and focused. When she saw him, across her face fear flickered, and despite her weakness, she tried to push herself away. Immediately Samuel stopped, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. "I am here to help. Water and food and clean bandages for your wounds I have brought." With deep suspicion, Naomi stared at him. "Why?" she managed to rasp out, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why would you help me?" 100 times since the previous night, Samuel had asked himself the same question. "Because what my father did to you was wrong," he said finally. "Because you should not have to suffer alone. Because I could not live with myself if I did nothing." Despite her weakened condition, her eyes sharp, Naomi continued to study him. "You are his son," she said. "You are just like him." As if she had struck him, Samuel flinched. "Maybe I am," he admitted. "Maybe for standing by and allowing these things to happen, I am just as guilty. But I am trying to be different. I am trying to do something right, even if it is too little and too late." A long silence followed. Then, her voice stronger now despite the pain, Naomi spoke again. "If your father finds out you are here, he will kill you. Or worse." Samuel nodded. "I know. But I am here anyway." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because him to approach she allowed. Enough to drink the broth. He helped her sit up, and then the bandages on her back he changed, cleaning the wounds again, and applying a salve his mother had once used for burns. Early signs of infection the wounds were showing, and without proper medicine, Samuel knew that Naomi's chances of survival were still precarious, but alive she was, and that was something. In whispers as he worked, they talked. About her life Naomi told him, about being born into slavery on a different plantation and being sold to Bellwether when she was 15. About the family she had been separated from, she told him. A mother and 2 younger sisters she had not seen in 8 years and had no way of finding. About the daily brutality of plantation life she told him, the constant hunger and fear and exhaustion that defined every waking moment. And Samuel listened, really listened to stories that he had been surrounded by his entire life, but had never truly heard. For the first time, not as abstractions or property, but as human beings with hopes and losses, and an inner life as rich and complex as his own, he was seeing the enslaved people on his father's plantation. To his core, it was a revelation that shook him. By the 3rd night, strong enough to sit up on her own, Naomi was, though her back was still a mass of healing wounds that would leave permanent scars. With more appetite, she ate the food Samuel brought, and some color had returned to her face. But more than her physical recovery, between them something else was happening. In the quiet darkness of that shed, 2 people who should never have connected in any world that made sense were forming a bond that transcended the brutal hierarchies of their society. Constantly during the day, Samuel found himself thinking about Naomi, counting the hours until he could return to the shed at night. And Naomi, despite every reason to distrust this white man, who was the son of her torturer, each evening found herself watching the door, waiting for his arrival. About everything and nothing they talked. About his education, Samuel told her. About the books he had read that had opened his eyes to different ways of seeing the world. About the songs her mother had taught her, Naomi told him. About the stories passed down through generations about a home across the ocean that none of them had ever seen. But in some deep cellular way, all of them remembered. About religion and philosophy they argued. Comfortable enough that words were not always necessary, they shared silence. And slowly, inevitably, impossibly, in love they fell. A love that could not exist in the world they inhabited it was. White was Samuel, the son of a plantation owner. Black was Naomi, enslaved, legally considered property rather than person. Not just forbidden, But criminally illegal was any relationship between them, subject to the most severe punishments the law and society could devise. And yet it happened anyway, because the laws that try to constrain them, human hearts do not always obey. On the fourth night, as Samuel was preparing to leave the shed, Naomi reached out and took his hand. Beyond the necessary contact as he tended her wounds, she had never touched him before. Profound but simple was the gesture, an acknowledgement of something that had grown between them. Down at her hand in his, Samuel froze, feeling the warmth of her skin, the gentle pressure of her fingers. When he looked up and met her eyes, what he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. "We cannot do this," he said, though no move to pull his hand away he made. "If anyone discovers they will kill you, they will kill both of us." Slowly, Naomi nodded. "I know, but in every way that matters, I am already dead, unless something changes. At least this way, I feel alive." Down beside her, Samuel sank, still holding her hand. "We have to leave," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "We have to run. To the fields you cannot go back, and out here forever I cannot keep sneaking. Someone will notice. What I have been doing, my father will discover. We have to leave Georgia. Leave the South entirely, somewhere we can be free find." With a mixture of hope and disbelief, Naomi looked at him. "Run where? What you are saying you do not understand. With scars on her back, I am an enslaved woman. From a prominent family, you are a white man. Where could we possibly go where we would be safe?" "North," Samuel said, though even as he said it, how inadequate the answer was he knew. "To a free state, to Canada, maybe." "Who help runaways? There are people, networks of abolitionists who provide safe houses and transportation. About them I have read. The Underground Railroad." Bitter, Naomi's laugh was. "About them you have read? But any idea how to actually find these people do you have? How many enslaved people die trying to make it north, do you know? How many are caught and brought back to face punishments worse than death?" He did not, Samuel had to admit. "But the alternative is for you to go back to the fields, where my father will eventually work you to death, and for me to stand by and watch it happen while I slowly become as monstrous as he is. I cannot do that. To die trying to escape than to live that way. I would rather." Through the rest of the night they talked, planning an escape that had more hope than strategy, more desperation than real chance of success. They would need supplies, money, weapons, and most importantly, before the inevitable pursuit began, they would need a head start. Over the next few days, Samuel would gather what he could, taking small amounts that would not be immediately missed. Then on a night with no moon, when darkness would provide maximum cover, they would run. Not a good plan it was. Barely a plan at all it was, but all they had it was. With a beauty that seemed cruel given what was about to happen, the fifth day dawned. Clear and blue was the sky, with the smell of jasmine and honeysuckle sweet was the air, and everything in shades of gold the morning light painted. Early Samuel woke, about what lay ahead, his stomach churning with anxiety. Today was the day. Tonight they would run. Carefully over the previous days, supplies he had gathered, a bag of food that could keep for the journey, a canteen for water, a knife for protection, matches wrapped in oilcloth, a compass stolen from his father's study, and 200 in gold coins that over the years, from birthday gifts and allowances he had saved. Not much it was, but everything he had it was. But as Samuel was preparing to hide the supplies in the shed, disaster struck. To the main parlor his father summoned him, and with a sense of foreboding that proved entirely justified, Samuel went. In his leather chair Thomas Bellwether sat, with Carver, the overseer, standing beside him. With expressions that made his blood run cold, both men looked at Samuel. The slave Naomi? Without preamble, Thomas said. To recover or die, she was left in the storage shed. But this morning when Carver went to check on her, intending to put her back to work if she had survived, evidence he found that someone has been tending her. Clean bandages, food, medicine. With a stare that could have cut glass, he fixed Samuel. Do you know anything about this? His heart stopped, Samuel felt. Through possible responses, denials, explanations, anything that might deflect suspicion, his mind raced. But a terrible liar he was, always had been, and already his face had betrayed him. Written there, his father saw the truth, and slowly from his chair rose, with menace his bulk filling the room. You, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. That slave you have been caring for. My own son sneaking around in the night, like a thief to tend to a piece of property that should have been left to die. To respond, Samuel opened his mouth, but no words came. That would make this better. What could he possibly say? With a cruel smile on his face, Carver stepped forward. From the house to the shed, tracks I found leading, fresh tracks in the morning dew, and these I found. The bag of supplies that Samuel had hidden for their escape that night ready, he held up. Damning and complete was the evidence. From red to purple with rage, Thomas's face went. Away with her you were planning to run, he said, each word dropping like a stone. My property you were planning to steal, my son, and away like a common thief run. Any idea what this means do you have? To our family name, what the disgrace of this would do? To Carver he turned. Get the men together. Arm them. Within the hour, I want every available man ready to ride, and the slave Naomi bring me. To watch what happens to people who defy me, I want her. Rising in his throat, Samuel felt panic. Father, please. You do not understand. Across the face with the back of his hand, Thomas struck him, a blow that sent Samuel staggering. Perfectly, I understand. Just like your mother was, you are weak. By Northern ideas and Negro sympathy, you have been corrupted. But this family destroy, I will not allow you. To that slave what I do you will watch, and then in your room you will be locked until what to do with you I decide. To gather the men and retrieve Naomi, Carver left. Over Samuel, with rage breathing heavily, Thomas stood. In the doorway, drawn by the commotion, Eli and Richard appeared, and to them the situation their father quickly explained. With a mixture of contempt and satisfaction, both brothers looked at Samuel. Always knew he was weak, Eli said. Now we have proof. What he called a hunting party Thomas began organizing, but what a lynching mob was, everyone understood. Within an hour, on horses 12 men were mounted, with rifles and pistols armed, accompanied by 4 bloodhounds trained to track human scent. Roughly from the shed they brought Naomi, despite her still healing wounds, dragging her. On the porch with a split lip, and the beginning of a black eye standing, when she saw Samuel. That they had been discovered she understood immediately. Everything they had not had time to say, all the possibilities of a future that was now being torn away before it could begin. The look they exchanged in that moment contained. But as the men were mounting their horses and preparing to ride out to make an example of Naomi, something unexpected happened. From the fields where enslaved workers were already at their morning labor, toward the main house a figure began walking. Enormous he was, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox and hands that looked capable of, with minimal effort, snapping a man's neck. Josiah was his name, and Naomi's older brother he was. Together to Bellwether Plantation 8 years earlier the two had been sold, and while in different parts of the property they worked and rarely saw each other, never broken the bond between them had. Within an inch of her life his sister beaten, Josiah had seen 5 days ago. The shed where to die she had been left he had watched, Samuel's nightly visits had noticed, and what was developing he had understood. Waiting, watching, for what he knew was coming, preparing himself he had been. Now, as toward horses and armed men his sister, being dragged he saw, as in Thomas Bellwether's eyes the murder he saw. Everything would change, a decision Josiah made that. Toward the group calmly he walked, his massive frame moving with a grace that for someone his size seemed impossible. First Carver saw him, and for him to get back to work yelled, but completely Josiah ignored him. Straight to where Naomi was being held he walked, and without a word, from the overseer's grip he reached out and pulled her away, as easily as plucking a flower. In surprise the overseer stumbled backward, and for a moment to react everyone was too shocked. With eyes that held no fear, only a calm certainty, at Thomas Bellwether Josiah looked. "My sister again you will not touch," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "For the crime of being loved you will not kill her. Go you will let her." At this enslaved man, who had just physically challenged him in front of his sons and his workers, Thomas stared, and beyond anything rational the rage that filled him was. "Kill him," he ordered. "Kill them both." Their rifles the mounted men raised. But with shocking speed Josiah moved. Of the nearest horse the bridle he grabbed and pulled, to the ground sending both horse and rider crashing. Before anyone could react, the fallen man's rifle he had seized, and against a fence post smashed it, in half breaking it. To attack on command trained. The bloodhounds at him rushed, but with bare hands Josiah met them, with blows that sent the animals yelping in retreat, striking them aside. In whispered stories for generations what happened next would be talked about. Against 12 one-man, against rifles and pistols unarmed, against masters who had the full force of law and society on their side, enslaved. In seconds, by every reasonable expectation, Josiah should have died. But for fury backed by desperation, for the strength of a man who had spent his entire life in brutal labor, or for the element of complete surprise, reasonable expectations did not account. Like a man possessed Josiah fought. He overturned horses, with his bare hands disarmed men. Like a force of nature through the chaos moved. Once in the shoulder he was shot, but not seemed to notice he did. Across his back with a rifle butt he was struck, but not slow he did. And through it all, between Naomi and the men who wanted to kill her, his body he kept. In disbelief watching from the porch, as this impossible scene unfolded Samuel stood. Drawn pistols his brothers had and were firing, but in the chaos, as likely to hit each other as Josiah they were. Over the pandemonium orders, that no one could hear his father was screaming. And in the midst of it all, Naomi Josiah grabbed onto one of the now riderless horses, lifted her, and with a strength that seemed superhuman, behind her vaulted up. Into motion he kicked the horse, and to run they began. Without thinking, purely on instinct, from the porch Samuel jumped, and to another loose horse ran. Into the saddle he swung himself, and into a gallop the animal kicked, as toward the tree line at the edge of the property they fled, following Naomi and Josiah. Behind him, his name his father screaming he heard, gunshots heard, but he did not stop. His choice he had made, perhaps the first real choice of his entire life. And now no going back there was. Into the forest the three of them crashed, at their faces branches whipping. Behind them the sounds of pursuit already organizing. Deeper into the woods, with the sure instinct of one who had spent years studying these lands, while laboring in them. Josiah led them. To confuse the dogs' scent trail. Through a creek they splashed, through dense underbrush that would slow horses pushed, and finally in a small clearing to assess their situation paused. From his shoulder, and from dozens of smaller cuts and scrapes, Josiah was bleeding. From the violent motion of the escape, Naomi's back had reopened, through her dress blood seeping. Uninjured but in shock was Samuel, his entire world having collapsed and reformed in the space of an hour. "We have to keep moving." His voice steady despite his injuries. Josiah said, "Right behind us they will be, and when they catch us, all of us they will kill." Numbly Samuel nodded. "I know a place, about 5 miles north, an old hunting cabin. For years it has been abandoned. There we can hide, your wounds treat, and our next move plan." Much of a plan it was not, but something it was. Hard they rode, to their limits the horses pushing, knowing that every minute of lead they gained might between life and death mean the difference. Behind them, a proper hunting party Thomas Bellwether was organizing. Beyond rage he was now, in a cold fury that was far more dangerous operating. Over family slaves he had chosen. His son had betrayed him, the Bellwether name had destroyed, and until all 3 of them were dead, not rest he would. 20 men he gathered, including both his remaining sons, and with dogs and guns and a determination to end this rebellion permanently set out. Had begun the hunt, and that only one side would survive to see its conclusion. Everyone involved understood. Exactly where Samuel remembered it. The old hunting cabin was a decrepit structure by the forest slowly being reclaimed. The roof leaked, broken were the windows, and clearly as shelter animals had been using it. But walls and a door it had, and more importantly, before being discovered remote enough that they might have a few hours it was. Inside, they dismounted, and with the cabin's few pieces of furniture immediately about barricading the door Josiah set. Down from the horse Samuel helped Naomi, and heavily against him she leaned, her strength finally giving out. That through the escape had carried her. The adrenaline was fading, and unbearable of her reopened wounds the pain was becoming. On the floor they laid her, and to rebandage her back as best he could, strips torn from his own shirt Samuel used. To examine his shoulder wound Josiah allowed Samuel. Cleanly the bullet had passed through, which was fortunate. But heavily it was still bleeding, and soon proper medical attention would need. As to stop the bleeding Samuel worked. For the first time since the escape, he and Josiah spoke. "Thank you," simply Samuel said. "Me you did not have to help, but you did." With eyes that held no warmth, at him Josiah looked. "You I did not help. My sister I helped. That came with saving her, you were just a complication." The words stung, but with them Samuel could not argue. "You are right. For what my family has done to you, to Naomi, to everyone on that plantation, I am sorry. I know saying sorry is not enough, but what else to say I do not know." For a long moment quiet was Josiah, his hand steady as his own shoulder he helped bandage. "My sister tells me kind to her you have been, that when you did not have to, her you cared for. With her away to run you were planning, everything to give up." Samuel's eyes he met. If that is love or guilt, or just the foolishness of a young man who is not through the consequences thought, I do not know. But in this now you are, and if us you slow down or betray you, before your father gets the chance, I will kill you myself. Samuel nodded. "I understand." Through a haze of pain to this exchange listening, weakly Naomi spoke up. "A good man he is, Josiah. From his father and brothers different. Him I trust." When at his sister he looked, slightly Josiah's expression softened. "Then him I will trust, too. For now." For perhaps 2 hours they rested, wounds treating and a plan trying to formulate. Of the route north general knowledge Samuel had, needed to reach Tennessee and then Kentucky they knew, eventually to Ohio making it, where illegal slavery was. But vague were the details, from abolitionist literature rather than practical experience drawn. From talking to other enslaved people knowledge Josiah had, about safe houses and friendly faces, whispered information, but for survival nothing concrete enough to guarantee. and by her injuries weakened. For the grueling journey that lay ahead, Naomi was in no condition. In the distance, through their planning, the sound of dogs baying cut closer the hunting party was getting, and before they found the cabin, only a matter of time it was. Now we have to move. To his feet despite his injury rising, Josiah said, "Here if they trap us, dead we are." "But ride Naomi cannot," Samuel protested. "Her the journey is killing." "Then her I will carry," Josiah replied. "And ahead you will scout to make sure clear the path is. With the burden we will take turns, but stop we will not, and caught we will not be." Just minutes before the hunting party arrived, the cabin they fled. Through the forest they ran. When she could not walk, Josiah carrying Naomi, with the compass he had stolen from his father Samuel leading the way. Relentless was the pursuit, to ensure that no rest, no moment of safety there was. Enough men and dogs Thomas Bellwether had brought. Every time they thought ground they had gained, closer the dogs getting they would hear. Through streams they waded, to confuse their trail doubled back, to create false paths split up and reunited. Without sleep they went, on wild berries and water from creeks surviving. By pure desperation beyond normal limits their bodies pushed. Who a life of relative comfort had lived, Samuel discovered reserves of endurance he did not know he possessed. Inside his boots, his feet blistered and bled. With exhaustion his muscles screamed. But because stopping meant death for all of them, he kept moving. Despite his shoulder wound, tireless Josiah proved to be, mile after mile without complaint Naomi carrying. And on the edge of consciousness hovering, with a determination born from a lifetime of surviving what should have killed her, Naomi held on. Of their flight on the third day, a river they reached, wide and fast moving, from recent rains swollen. Behind them, closer the sounds of pursuit were getting. Their scent again the dogs had picked up, and before the hunting party caught up, perhaps an hour they had. "We have to cross," the rushing water studying Samuel said. "To the other side, if we can make it, our scent trail the river will break. Us the dogs will not be able to track." With skepticism at the river Josiah looked. "In her condition Naomi cannot swim, her the current will take. Then a raft we will build," Samuel said. "No time there is," Josiah replied. "But for logs and rope, anything that could be lashed together into something that would float." Already around he was looking. With frantic speed they worked, to bind together fallen logs using vines. Barely seaworthy the result was, of actual reliable craft more suggestion than raft. But all they had it was. Into the water they pushed it and aboard climbed. In the center Naomi lying, while with long poles their makeshift vessel Samuel and Josiah tried to guide. Immediately them the current grabbed, far faster than they had anticipated downstream pulling them. Spun and bucked the raft, over the logs water washing, their flimsy construction apart threatening to tear. With one hand to Josiah, and with the other to Naomi, Samuel clung, for their lives all three of them holding on as them the river tried to claim. Against rocks they crashed, through rapids were thrown, and for several terrifying minutes certain Samuel was that drown they would. But somehow, miraculously, on the raft they stayed, and eventually toward the far bank them the current pushed. Soaking wet and exhausted, but alive and across the river, ashore they scrambled. Behind them, on the opposite bank, from the tree line, the hunting party emerging they could see. At the water's edge Thomas Bellwether stood, with an expression of pure hatred across at them staring. For a moment, across the water at each other the two groups simply looked, hunter and hunted, father and son, enslaver and enslaved. Then his rifle Thomas raised and fired. Across the river the shot echoed, but for accuracy the distance was too great. Harmlessly into the water the bullet splashed. Again and again Thomas fired. in futile rage his rifle emptying. Then the gun he lowered, and simply there stood, as into the forest on the far bank his son, and the two slaves disappeared. Triumph Samuel wanted to feel, their escape wanted to celebrate, but all he felt was a deep aching sadness. His family, his home, his entire identity he had lost, and even though the right thing he had done he believed, even though the same choice he would make again, still profound the loss was. For 3 more weeks they traveled, ever northward moving, gradually behind of immediate pursuit the danger leaving, but into new dangers entering. No money they had now, in the chaos of the escape the supplies having lost. On what they could forage or steal they survived, at night into farmhouses slipping to take eggs or vegetables, always before discovery moving. Several times slave catchers they encountered, who their living capturing runaways and returning them for rewards made bounty hunters. A test of luck and quick thinking each encounter was. In a barn, once they hid while the property catchers searched, as within feet of their hiding spot the men came their breath holding. Another time after by men on horses being chased, split up they had to and miles later reunite. Slowly, painfully, north progress they made. From Georgia into Tennessee they crossed, around major towns where the risk of being caught was highest skirting. In unexpected places help they found, despite the risk to themselves, who provided food and directions, a free black family. In his barn to sleep allowed them, and against the growing cold of autumn shoes and coats gave them, a Quaker farmer. In them a chance to strike back against the system she hated saw, who to the slave trade sons had lost, an elderly white woman. Alive them these moments of kindness kept, and hope gave them that more than just cruelty and greed the world contained. Slowly Naomi's wounds healed, though for the rest of her life the scars she would carry. Enough that the arm again he could use Josiah's shoulder mended, though quite its full strength never it would have quite, and into someone harder Samuel transformed, who for principal privilege and safety had given up, and that the trade, while costly, something he never had before had given him found self-respect. As into Kentucky, the final slave state before reaching free territory, they crossed. That actually they might succeed themselves, they allowed to believe. One more state. As around a small fire in a cave hidden from the road they huddled, Samuel said, "One more state, and in Ohio we will be. Free you will be." With skepticism at him Josiah looked. Will we? Or in a different state fugitives will we just be, always over our shoulders looking, always one capture away from being sent back? For that, because Josiah was right, no answer Samuel had. Not the same thing were legal freedom and actual safety. And even into a free state crossing, the danger or the past erase would not. But out her hand Naomi reached and Samuel's took, the same gesture she had made in the shed weeks ago. And when she spoke, steady her voice was, "More free than we are now we will be. A chance we will have. Than we had before, that is more. And maybe enough, that is." On a cold October night the Ohio River they reached. Dark and forbidding under a sliver of moon the water. Across that river was Ohio. Freedom was. Of a life they controlled rather than one that was controlled for them. The possibility was. Leaking but serviceable, an abandoned rowboat they found and into the current pushed out. Hours the crossing seemed to take, though probably only minutes it was. Impossibly loud every splash of the oars sounded. Like an alarm being raised every light on either shore seemed, but them no one stopped. As far as they could tell, them no one even saw, and when against the far shore the boat scraped, and onto the muddy bank of Ohio they stepped, something shifted. Not entirely safe they were. That they could still be captured and returned meant fugitive slave laws. But in free territory they were. And something that meant, to a settlement they had been told about. They made their way, a community of free black people and sympathetic whites who from slavery refugees helped. In taken they were, food and shelter and medical attention given. For the first time properly Naomi's back was treated. By an actual doctor, Josiah's shoulder was examined. And since the escape without dreaming of pursuit, for the first time Samuel slept. In the months that followed, new lives they began building. As a blacksmith, Josiah found work. Despite the prejudice, he faced his strength and skill with metal, making him valuable. As a seamstress, Naomi worked, and slowly her health and strength regained. And as a teacher, Samuel worked, whose parents had fled slavery, children educating for something meaningful rather than merely his father's exploitation, managing his education using. In a small ceremony by the community that had taken them and attended, he and Naomi married. In many states illegal it was, between a white man and a black woman, this marriage, but in their small corner of Ohio, together a life they were able to build. Not easy it was. Forever from his family Samuel was cut off. Before she died from his mother only one letter receiving, in which that what he had done she understood, and of him was proud, she wrote, though openly never she could say so. No money, no property he had, and to survive manual labor had to work. From his previous life of privilege a shocking change. In her body and her nightmares the trauma of slavery Naomi carried, convinced she was back on Bellwether Plantation. Some nights waking, and from people who believed the natural order they had violated, constant prejudice and hostility, both of them faced. But also something precious they had. Each other they had. Freedom they had. And rather than having it chosen for them, their path they had chosen. Who also had escaped slavery, a woman Josiah eventually met, and together a family they built. Close the three of them remained, Samuel, Naomi, and Josiah, by the shared experience of that desperate flight and everything it had cost them bound. Years later, when finally the Civil War came and slavery was abolished, to what remained of his family in Georgia, a letter Samuel wrote, a response he never received. During the war his father had died. By Union troops his plantation burned. For the Confederacy fighting his brother Eli had been killed. Georgia his brother Richard had survived but left, and where he had gone no one knew. Had destroyed itself the world that Samuel had been born into, and from the ruins something new was being built. Though generations that construction would take, and from complete far was. On quiet evenings, on the porch of their small house, Samuel and Naomi would sit and the sunset watch, just as they had in that shed so long ago, holding hands. About their children they would talk. 3 sons and 2 daughters who had been born free. And except through their parents' stories, the horror of slavery never would know. And sometimes that desperate flight they would remember. The days of running, the moments when certain death seemed. What do you think would have happened if never to that shed you had come? Naomi once asked. If they're to die like your father intended me, you had left. For a long moment quiet was Samuel. The rest of my life as a coward I think I would have lived, he finally said. Just like my father eventually I would have become. That the system was not my fault, while every day from it benefiting, telling myself, wealthy and respected and completely empty I would have died. His hand Naomi squeezed. And in that shed alone and forgotten I would have died, so each other we saved, I suppose. That is exactly right, Samuel replied. We saved each other. Of Samuel Whitmore and Naomi and Josiah. The story eventually, in certain abolitionist circles, a whispered legend became. Who everything gave up to save the woman he loved, a white plantation owner's son, who survived torture and from an impossible source the courage to accept love had, an enslaved woman. To protect his sister a lynch mob single, handedly fought off a brother. That even in the face of systematic evil, individual courage could matter. The kind of story that inspired hope it was, but also more complicated than legend suggested it was. For 22 years before he finally acted, complicit in slavery Samuel had been, while real 2 decades of passive acceptance of evil his moment of courage did not erase. Escaped Naomi and Josiah had, but on Bellwether Plantation hundreds of other people remained enslaved, and on thousands of other plantations just like it. And even in freedom, from a society that was built on white supremacy, regardless of whether slavery was legal, discrimination and violence they faced. But incomplete, real the happy ending was, at enormous cost purchased, and by the knowledge of how many others, never the chance to escape, got shadowed. When a master's son, a sick enslaved woman in secret cared for, and how that simple act of human decency into events that everyone shocked and multiple lives forever changed cascaded. This is the story. About love that should not have been possible it is, courage that was both too late and just in time, and the complex reality that even when from evil systems individuals break free, until completely dismantled those systems continue to do harm, not just in the escape or the violence or the forbidden romance was the shock, though all of those elements present were, in the revelation that when as fully human rather than as property or abstractions, people are seen, when fear and conditioning, love and courage overcome, the impossible can sometimes become real. The real shock was that while strong, not unbreakable the chains of slavery and prejudice were, Samuel, Naomi, and Josiah proved that even in the darkest moment, even when certain death seemed still between accepting evil and fighting against it, a choice to be made there was. And to fight they chose. In shock, everyone left. That choice and everything it cost them was what?